And what I'll do now, just put you in a tar barrel and light you a fire and roll it down the hill, and that would be a right idea. Put Buki in a tar barrel, light him a fire, roll him down the hill. Jack and Greenleaf married in peace, live in a piece of candle grease. It was surprising to everybody to see how those two couple live. Now, who don't think my old story is true, just can ask the captain of the longboat crew, and ask Bernard. He upholds me. He could tell you better. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. My name is Ian, and today we're talking about Daniel Crowley's form and style in Bahamian Folktale. Crowley's an interesting dude. He was stricken with polio when he was serving in the war. And he had this, he was rendered basically partially quadriplegic. He was in a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. But he's able to go to university on the GI Bill, and he eventually became one of the most important anthropologists of Festival, and he helped to sort of, if not necessarily invent, then reinvent African studies. This was after his graduate work in the Bahamas, and the Bahamas was I think his first encounter with field work. He actually went on to earn Guinness Book of World Records for the most traveled paralyzed man. Just a remarkably gregarious person. His New York Times obituary says something like he thought that his New York Times obituary would begin, crushed to death at Carnival by 50,000 dancing sambas, 50,000 samba dancers. So yeah, he's kind of cool. And he was really early in this shift. I mean, as we talk about the shift in folklore studies and folk tale studies away from text to performance, he was kind of doing that before there was really a language for it. He was pointing to the fact that, okay, well, we have this thing, but what happens when we have a text that we can easily recognize as whatever word we want to use, borrowed, or has entered into the tradition, or has been adapted, or has leaked, or whatever metaphors we wish to use. Elsewhere, we can identify that this is a tale, and particularly this is Arne Thompson Uther type 300, into a community that historically wouldn't have it because they don't have necessarily genetic ancestry from it, and they have their own narrative traditions. But what do we do with that fact? And because after a while, the question is, so what? And he's dancing around this issue in part because he's not quite, the discipline hasn't caught up with him, and therefore he doesn't quite have the language to start talking about this process where it's not adaptation, it's not curation, it's not some kind of passive absorption. Here's a narrative that somehow, irrespective of how it got into the community, which is an interesting note, certainly worth pursuing, but also largely irrelevant. There's a story that somehow finds some kind of traction within this community, that people want to tell it, people want to listen to it, and it is relevant to it. And it's a recognized artistic form within that community. So these are his questions. He has this distinction between form and style, where form is he's basically talking about the general pattern. Like when people in the Bahamas, and specifically, I guess you could say, people from Andros Island, which is one of the sort of outer islands, although it's actually one of the larger islands at the same time, but it is sort of distant from the political center that is around Nassau, which is where he did his field work. When they are telling these stories, they enter into some kind of patterning of talk. And so there is this, basically, he might have used the word, because it's not quite ecotype, because ecotype is what we talk about when we're talking about the actual sort of plot, the type. And so we have 300, or we have 510A, or we have whatever, and then we'll have the French version, the German version, the Bahamian version. But he's not really talking in terms of the way a particular tale is manifested on the level of accumulated motifs and the names of characters and so on, although that is certainly part of it. Rather, he's talking about the performance that's indicative, or the stylization. I don't want to use the word stylization because he reserves style for the individual teller. So you sort of have, we know that, how to express it? We know that the telling of a tale is often entering into this different framing of talk, and that once you do something like an introductory formula, the once upon a time, or in the Bahamian situation, Bunday, you know that the talk that follows is going to be of a certain type, of a certain kind, of a certain form, and so on. Now, he's saying, all right, that's cool, and that will happen in Germany, and that will happen in France, and it'll happen in the Bahamas, and this is how it happens in the Bahamas. So it's this kind of general eco aesthetics, of tale telling, oiko aesthetics, I guess, a regional variation, the Bahamian manner of telling a tale. Then it gets manifested on the level of style, how an individual does that. Because again, when we talk about folklore, we're talking about expectations. We are talking about an audience with a certain form of expectations, and we're talking about a teller with a certain fluidity with those expectations, the ability to fulfill, both in terms of plot, but also in terms of the non-textual elements, the performance, the witticisms, the variations, the imagination that they might bring to how do you take this thing that is already, there's a certain number of predictable things, and how do you take the predictable and turn it into something that is nevertheless novel and aesthetically pleasing? This both and situation. And so form is like, all right, when we Bahamians get together and this kind of talk happens, this is what we can expect. Now, when Albert Gay does it, how does he do it in a particular way that still meets those expectations but brings it onto the level of the particular? And now, us as the outsiders, through the avatar that is Daniel Crowley, he's saying, okay, we have this language for what we understand the general patterns of tale-telling performing aesthetics to be. Okay, now I'm grasping the Bahamian version, and I'm grasping the Bahamian version because I'm also seeing these two individuals, and of course the many others that he collected from. So that's that kind of focus that he's doing. So the term in the Bahamas for immersion is an old story, and the name of the book that he eventually produced, which is a pivotal, incredibly important book in folklore studies, is I Could Talk Old Story Good. And there, even the way that there's like a folk origin story for how these tales were told, and said, when it became necessary to stay in the fields overnight as the nearer land became worked out, to control and assuage their fears of spirits, they told stories. Good ones were remembered and retold by the hearers. Individual storytellers would add distinct elements, including incorporating news and local characters, and the stories then spread to the villages. So it doesn't really matter where the stories come from, but the idea that there is a folk origin for the storytelling seems to suggest something about it. The contemporary modern generation, I've been sort of looking up in terms of what this neighborhood was like, 1950s Bahamas, and it was this influx of the beginnings of many of the people who were living in this neighborhood at this time later on played pivotal roles. I think he was staying at the Reinhardt Hotel. He describes it as, he gives the address at Tin Shop Corner, Blue Hill Road, Grantstown. And there was a hotel that was built there in the 1930s by Walker, I believe his name was, who's a local medical doctor. But they needed a hotel because this was still British colony, and they needed a hotel for the that visiting black people could stay at, because they weren't able to actually stay in the hotels in downtown Nassau. So it became this pivotal site. And I imagine that Crowley, as Catholic as he was in his tastes, thought this would be a better place than certainly staying at the in the white hotels. And his wife was Trinidadian, so he might not have been allowed to stay at the downtown hotels. But then, I think this is where these tales were told. So you had this neighborhood that was politically active and emerging. As many, sometimes it's described as by Crowley himself as like the poor or the working class neighborhoods, and it certainly had immigrants from the other islands as part of it, but also this sort of hotbed of activity. But you did have those tensions. You had, as always, you have in any such context, you have the people who are trying to emerge and participate in sort of the larger cosmopolitanism, and therefore are kind of dismissive of the folk ways. And then you had people who were either, had been kept specifically out from that generational, class ascendancy narratives, or were disinterested in them, and so they were actively participating. So you had these creative tensions. So the younger generations were certainly the urban Nassau were less inclined to look on these stories fondly, but there's an indication that, as always, they were parts of entertainments that would happen at the end of the day. People would come in, they would swap news events, and then slowly but surely they would get into these tales. They might have been occasionally directed towards children, but just like so many different contexts, just like we've seen, just like in the Russians, just like in Denmark, just like in Cape Breton. If the tale telling actually occurs when children are there might be a special repertoire specifically for children, and then after a while the children go to bed and the stories still continue, and they're not understood as being children's entertainments. It's not like, let's keep on doing this childish thing. They are entertainments. It's a standard thing to remind ourselves of. So they were recorded in as natural a context as it possibly could, and he's given these sort of anthropological settings, and so it's always good to evaluate someone's field work. And again, it's sort of emerging at it, and he's indicating that people were interested on the microphone and the tape recorder for the first time, and they would every time a tale was recorded, they immediately had to listen back to it, because this might have been the first time that they had ever heard their voices, and they would come by a couple of hours or a couple of days later sometimes and bring a friend. It was like, look, I got my voice recorded. And so it was innovative. But we should always remember that this thing like voice recording is reasonably new. And there weren't field recordings done in Atlantic Canada until the late 1940s. There was field work done, but they didn't bring recording devices until the 40s and 50s. So this is the exact same time. So I think through our lenses, we might be sort of, because of our latent white supremacy, we might be thinking this Bahamian background is incredibly behind the times, but it is almost exactly coincident with the times in the Cape Breton context as well. And then he includes the texts, because this is textual analysis. And I read at the beginning of this a little bit of out loud, which always for me veers on that strange end of cultural appropriation. I'm never quite sure, because it is done in the patois. And he says later on, standard spelling alone cannot screen out the flavor of the Bahamian idiom. So there's a certain amount of imitative language when one reads it out. But you do get a sort of a taste of how it would have sounded. And there's lots of references. They are modern. They're referencing to local culture, to the emerging style. Even if they're recognized as being traditional, they are always being made ongoingly relevant. So it's always good to look at the precise way a tale is told. Because they have things like local customs are mentioned, like sailbags, and the various things like the patriarchal responsibility for choosing daughters' mates, but also Buckingham Palace is mentioned, and machine guns are mentioned. So, Buckingham Palace has been around for a very long time, but certainly it's like not part of indigenous Bahamian folklore. It is part of the colonial enterprise and the recognition and the understanding of the colonial enterprise, and probably the bleeding over of news from London into the everyday, because they're media savvy and radio announcer voices and so on. And machine guns, again, an invention of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And there's also responses from the audience that are kind of expected. This heightened sense of reaction. Tears of laughter come to many eyes, and there was a much slapping of knees, clapping of hands, and agonized rolling on the floor in helpless merriment. This form of expression is socially approved, and I believe often exceeds the actual amusement felt. So again, I think the idea that by being a member of the audience, there's also a set of expectations of behavior and expectations of what's meant to go through. So one of the things about form is the key and most notable one is the opening, is the use of bunde, where bunde is this sort of indicator. It's like, I would say it's a nonsense word, but it isn't, because it's clearly understood within this context of having a specific meaning. So it's a nonsense word, but only really invoked at this particular time. And one can go into a crowded situation, and if you start saying bunde regularly enough, you can actually attract the attention of tellers, of an audience, and like basically indicating, I'm going to be telling a story. And so bunde, bunde, and then when you get the whole crowds are responding, bunde, then you can enter into like a different kind of opening formula. But bunde becomes this kind of strange paragraphing, as it were. It's a thing that is regularly reminding people not simply that a story is being told, but because it kind of demands a response, that they are to be engaged in it. So it's polysemic. It doesn't necessarily mean anything save for an act of storytelling is going on, but then different qualities to it. So you can use it to express approval. You can use it to, as I said, sort of paragraph a mark by moving on from one point to another. That being said, there are actual formulaic openings and formulaic closings. There's what he calls sings, or certain dialogue is, or not even necessarily dialogue. It could be humming, but sort of little musical motifs that, again, are not necessary, as it were, for the communication of the story, but are indicative of something and given license because the Bahamian form allows for this. There seems to be a certain delight in, he calls them tall tales, but the remarkable exaggeration as a form. So if we think back to things like what Ulrich talks about in his epic laws in terms of law of contrast, you perhaps want to add an additional epic law of Bahamian folk narrative in terms of exaggeration, in terms of sort of this again, epic tall tale type of exaggeration. And there seems to be a certain creativity or approval of the creativity of being able to draw motifs from different stories and string them into one. So let's borrow the Jack and the Beanstalk, fee fi fo fum. Let's borrow some other things. And so there's a kind of, he wouldn't be using these words because these words weren't invented yet, but there seems to be a little bit of playful intertextualism, as it were. It's like, oh, okay, this is the story, and he's just like digging into this for a little second. And I seem to appreciate that. And but there also seems to be sort of stock characters, in as much as we can think about prop and the hero, the villain, and so on. This is before prop would have been translated widely. So Crowley wouldn't know this, but there's a distinct argument to be made that in these tales, what he could be talking about is how, I mean, he says that the Jack is inevitably the name of the hero, Greenleaf is inevitably the name of fundamentally the princess, and he could be using, because the forms are so regular, he could be making a direct correlation between the dramatis personae and how they are typically named, whether or not those names bespeak specific characterizations when it actually comes to being told. So, yeah. So again, the style. That one of the things that's important is probably the level of like an enregisterment. That while talking, there is a certain amount of specifically using, even more than one might normally use, Bahamian English, emphasizing those things in the same way that enregisterment's an interesting term. It's a way of code switching fundamentally, where one is deliberately pronouncing, affecting an accent or affecting a particular vocabulary that is self-consciously aware is of place. And it's usually done in a sort of a playful kind of way, but lo and behold, all of a sudden, you come across it in Cape Breton a lot, where you'll be having a meeting or conversation with people, and they might, have a local accent, but their vocabulary is the same as one would find anywhere. And then, one switches into sort of a more playful moment, like coffee break or something, or a story comes through, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, my son. And they, that they're very aware. You can tell it's a conscientious move to perform Cape Bretonness when the performance of Cape Bretonness was not suitable, as it were. And it isn't a matter of being disingenuous, it's a matter of entering into a different frame. And so that's one of the frames that's being entered into when one is telling stories. That being said, they can also employ King's English as a form of characterization. So demonstrating that bilingualism, or at least the dual codes of consulting, or how one, at least if not necessarily is able to regularly communicate with, at least how one interprets colonizer use of English, and then how one overemphasizes, but for artistic purposes, overemphasizes the colonized forms of that language. Albert Gay and Ezekial Mackey, they are related by marriage. They are both from the same community of Bering Point on Andros Island. And Albert was such a prize that they brought him over. Specifically, Crowley's host said, you should really collect from this guy, because he was, and so they, hopped on sent a boat, and hopped on for a 90-mile boat trip to Nassau in order to simply to be a informant, as they would have used in those days, for Crowley. So, and Ezekiel, or Zeke, was his young relative who learned most of his stories from them. So they are interrelated in terms of style, but they have different forms. Albert is a bit more in tune with expressing things through dialogue. Ezekiel is sort of more fascinated by sort of the absurdities that he brings up, and he chooses to explore them. He's also much more willing to introduce modern elements than Albert is, but Albert is not particularly old-fashioned. They're only about 20 years apart. Albert's in his mid-40s, Ezekiel is in his mid-20s. And so they are distinct tellers, but they are interrelated. They're both clearly taking the expectations of the Bahamian folktale style and developing them into something, and creating a reputation for fluency. Presumably, Ezekiel, who's living in Nassau at the time, presumably he wants to develop the same kind of reputation for competency that Albert Gay has, so much so that he can be, he one day will be shipped 90 miles just so someone can hear his stories. And there's some wonderful descriptions on 231 to 233. There's a bit of a, like a what the hey, and remembering that this was written in 1952, and I think this is meant to be sympathetic, but it still doesn't sound great. Crowley says, both informants are deviants. Both are extremely poor and work only intermittently. Both have a fondness for rum. Both are sharply intelligent and capable of being caustic. Both are beloved and defended by their friends. Both are sentimental, demonstrative, extreme in gesture and thought, unstable, and both are recognized as superior talkers of old story. I think this is sort of tying in with the idea of the artist as some kind of inherently marginal figure. There's a sort of romanticization. That being said, they might actually be based on Crowley's own observations, and so you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt, and think about whether the artist is someone who is inherently sort of peripheral and cannot, participate as sort of a full-fledged member of the community, but is then given license to do so because of the power of their artistry, or whether that's just a romantic lens that we view them through. And it might not sound romantic, but we see it time and again in terms of the way that we phrase and frame artists, and even particularly folk performers in our culture. So again, this is 1952 that he's doing this field work, and it is remarkably modern sounding. Again, lacking some of the vocabulary that it would come later because people would be turning to his work as an example. So the fact that he doesn't have the vocabulary is not his deficit. It is, I'm too busy doing the work of making these observations, fumbling towards theorizing. You guys can build on it and do the theorizing afterwards. But he says this, it is difficult to discuss old stories in any but theatrical terms, but if this is allowed, it would seem that the Bahamian old story talker is at once playwright, director, and cast, that he calls upon his tradition for theme, theatrical conventions, and a modicum of characterization. The effectiveness of the old story as an art form is attested by its vitality among acculturated Bahamians today. And he makes one last page where he's basically sort of talking about the source of the story itself, which is probably expected then. And I think it's, on one hand, he makes very, very modern conclusions about a question that is perhaps in itself old-fashioned, about the issue of borrowing, the issue of how it came into being, in the local repertoire and these two tellers' repertoires. And I think one of the aspects that we always need to consider, because the issue is it the worse for wear? By entering into a different context, which is, I'm presuming, different from European, continental, or Anglo storytelling performance context, are they the worse for wear? That's the expression that gets used over and over again that he's quoting. And said, well, they're different. They have been changed. And the question is, have they been changed because they are bad tellers? Have they been changed because they are being forcefully shoehorned into their own storytelling traditions and expectations and aesthetics? Or have they changed because change is allowed, change is good, and there's no force, there's no smoothing out, there's no jettisoning stuff. It isn't a matter of, I have this thing and I can't do it the way that it was done before. It was, I have this thing. What can I do with it? And I think those are two fundamentally different questions, because there's this notion of a sort of stewardship that's still present within the storytelling literature of this time, and it continues into this day, into this century, of how do we account for change? And Crowley is on the cusp of, you could tell how sympathetic he is to the tellers to Albert Gay and Ezekial Mackey. In fact, in some versions of this, they are listed as co-authors of this particular article because they contribute so much. But the question that remains is, does he quite have the language yet to suggest that they are not adapting this thing as best as they can in a kind of patronizing way, this thing being type 300, to meet the expectations of their audiences? Or is it just they are fundamentally creating something and they are not responsible for how it was done before? They're not responsible for the European tradition. They do not need to hold the European tradition into some kind of esteem or respect. They don't have to disrespect it either. It doesn't have to enter into the equation whatsoever. And I think Crowley is almost ready to say that. It's not quite. Other people will soon. And I can't begin to tell you how important this article and really the book that Aikatako Storygood came from it. The only problem with Aikatako Storygood is that it's difficult to abstract particular chapters from it. But it is one of those pivotal moments because he is thinking about performance and his the discipline, the North American discipline, isn't quite there yet. And he's going to bring them there. Slowly but surely, he's going to bring them there. Anyway, so this has been Ian, your best friend, discussing Daniel Crowley's form and style in a Bahamian folktale. As ever, I wish you the utmost best. Be well, my friends.